Good morning, Christ Community Church. So good to see you. Some of you thought that last guy was me, right? Because we got the same barber. But yeah, that's my good buddy Alex. And I want to introduce you to our guest. But before our guest comes out, quick trivia question. And it's multiple choice answers here. And don't call it out. Just lock in one of the answers. And then we'll take a vote. We'll see who wins here. So what is an axolotl? That's the question. So is it A, an instrument played with a hammer, much like a xylophone? B, a type of salamander that never grows up? C, a vehicle with more than two axles? Or D, a famous saying that does not make sense? Are you ready? How many say A? Okay, it's an instrument. Some of you are a little tentative, like I want to see more hands before I put mine up, all right? How about B, a type of salamander? Okay, number of people. C, vehicle with more than two axles? Come on, I worked hard on that one. A lot of axle, come on. How about D, a famous saying that does not make sense? Okay, a whole bunch of you. Right answer is, it's the salamander. All right, and here's what he looks like. You could buy one of those suckers for like $70 and take it home, all right? What does this have to do with anything? Well, it's this. This salamander never grows up like some Christ followers I know. They never grow up in the faith. And if you surrender your life to Jesus, that's the starting line. That's not the finish line. So one of the parts of our mission here at the church is to help you grow in your faith. And so we got a mission statement. You'll see growing right in the middle of the statement. I want you to say this. Let's recite it together, okay? With your outdoor voice. Here we go. Our goal is to make passionate disciples of Jesus Christ who are belonging, growing, serving, and reaching. I like the accent on growing there. So we consider this statement so important that this ministry season, we decided to do a series on each of those marks of a disciple, 4 marks. So back in September, we did a series called Disciples Serve. That's the one we started with. And then in November, it was Disciples Reach, and in January it was Disciples Belong, and today we're starting a 5-part series, Disciples Grow. And one of the key tools that God uses to grow you as a follower of Jesus is the Bible, God's holy word. But here's a problem. A lot of people have difficulty believing the Bible. They've heard it's full of myths and legends and contradictions and errors, and over time it got passed on and corrupted and whatever. So can you really trust the Bible? So we decided to bring an expert in from the outside. So next week we're going to have Bible Part 2. I'm going to talk to you about how to use a Bible. But today we're going to settle the issue of the Bible's reliability, its credibility. So would you join me in giving a warm Christ Community Church welcome to Dr. Bill Mounce.
Hey, thanks.
Wow, so, when Bill comes out, I got to smile a little bit because last night for our evening service, he got here, but his suitcase didn't. And so he went from his hotel to Goodwill and bought a $6 shirt to wear last night. So you're looking much more dapper than you did last night.
Thank you.
So, Bill, I'm going to start in the shallow end of the pool, all right? So before we get into the kind of heady academic stuff, when people hear Bible scholar, we got a Bible scholar on stage here today, they think of a dude who spends a lot of his time in a library surrounded by musty books. And so we want you to humanize yourself a little bit. Tell us about your family. Tell us about what you do for fun. Do you have fun, Bill?
I have fun. I have a lot of fun. More fun than I should. Married for 41 years. This is the picture of my youngest son's wedding. My son on the left is a marketer in Southern California, and now I have two grandkids there, so we go down there a lot to see them. And then Hayden is a master tiler. He does tiles and bathrooms and stuff. It's a work of art. And his wife is Palestinian, and they want to go to the mission field eventually. So we'll see what happens with that. And then my daughter has a PhD in art history and unfortunately lives in Berlin. So I don't get to see her much, 4 times or so a year. So anyway, that's my family. For fun, we live in the northeast corner of Washington State, 16 minutes below Canada, pretty close to Idaho. And it's very secluded. We live on a gorgeous river. So all summer long, people come up and I drag him behind the boat on inner tubes, or I drag him behind the boat, depending upon the kind of mood I'm in. And we do that. But I actually spend most of my time with the ministry I help run called biblicaltraining.org. And like you, we were concerned about the lack of spiritual growth in so many churches. And a lot of spiritual growth is tied into ignorance of the Bible. So we have a world-class education that we give away for free so that you can learn in the church. And that takes up a lot of my time.
That's pretty cool. Now, last night over dinner, you showed me a picture out your front door. What do you see if you look out the front door of your house?
Grizzly bears and trees.
And trees.
And trees, yeah. All the bad bear grizzlies, bad bear meaning they get too familiar with people, they tranquilize them, put a chip in them, and they dump them across the river. And unfortunately, they don't come over, except for one came over this summer, and he was a problem.
Is it a dangerous place to live out in the wilds like
It's
that?
dangerous in that there's 2 wolf packs. And so you have to carry. And I want to make sure it's okay to say this in Chicago. We shoot a lot. And but if you don't carry,
there's a lot of shooting in Chicago too.
Yeah. Well, up there, the wolves will eat you. They'll eat your dogs. They'll eat your horses. They'll kill. And I think a moose wakes up every morning in a bad mood. And you can't shoot a moose because you can't kill it, but at least you can slow it down when you're running.
Sounds like fun.
Yeah, it is. It's a lot of fun.
I'm coming to visit. So what prompted you to give your life to the study of the Bible?
It really was a God thing. I was a photography major in college. I loved photography. I loved telling stories with pictures, but I knew I wasn't going to do it for the rest of my life. And I took my first New Testament survey class, and middle of the second week, it just kind of clicked. And I knew I was committing myself to about 10 more years of school, but it clicked in the way that nothing else had ever clicked with me before.
Cool.
Yeah.
So when we think about the Bible's credibility, there are a lot of folks who appear on the news or they're quoted in magazine sources that are debunking the Bible, and they're scholars, quote unquote. So we kind of want to know what makes you a scholar. Like, can we trust what you're about to say to us in this interview? What qualifies you to do what you do?
I love Jesus. How about we start with that?
Okay.
Did a master's at Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, did a PhD in Aberdeen University in Scotland. We get to go back to this summer. I haven't been back in 40 years. I started writing a lot when I first started teaching, and the New Testament's written in the Greek language, and I just fell in love with Greek. And the difference is that most people who write Greek textbooks are good at languages. I'm not. Languages are hard for me. So I wrote a totally different kind of textbook and reference book. So I'd write a lot. Most people, my reputation mostly is a translator. I was some of you use the English Standard Version? Some?
Yeah, we heard.
All right, there you go. ESV. I was the New Testament chair of the ESV. And then when that was done, I switched over to the translation committee for the NIV, the New International Version, which is the Bible you all use.
Yes.
And so I really enjoy translation. These committees are like giant Bible studies where you got a bunch of really smart people. And you just learn and you learn and you learn.
Wow. So just for clarification's sake, for people who don't know, the Old Testament, the first half of our Bible that was prior to Christ, written in Hebrew, translated into English in our English version. The New Testament written in Greek, and so that you're a Greek scholar, have written a grammar book that's being used all over the place to learn the Greek New Testament. So that's pretty cool. So we're talking today about the trustworthiness of the Bible. What a lot of people don't know is that the Bible's not one book. The Bible is actually 66 books in one cover. And these 66 books were written by 40-some authors, several different languages, several different continents over a period of 1,500 years. And now they're all together as one volume. But in this conversation, we're just going to zero in on the New Testament and specifically the first part here on the biographies of Jesus. So there are 4 biographies of Jesus in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. A lot of people say these were built on the oral passing on of stories about Jesus. And so it took hundreds of years before they finally made it into print. And by that time, the stories were all twisted. They were blown out of proportion. Jesus never claimed to be some of the stuff that the current, what we have in our Bible claims he said and whatnot. So I want to know who really wrote these books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Yeah.
Is it true hundreds of years after the life of Jesus?
Yeah, absolutely not. Even liberal scholars understand that the four Gospels are all first century documents. Mark was probably written the end of 50s, beginning of the 60s. John was the latest. Sometimes people put him in 90 AD, which is all within a lifespan of a person. Some people actually date John before AD 70, before Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. But either way you go with, the Gospels are first century documents written by the people that, for Matthew, Mark, and John's case, had firsthand knowledge of Jesus. Luke's was all secondhand. So no, they weren't written hundreds of years later. There were Gospels written hundreds of years later, but they're not part of the Bible.
Okay, and we'll come back to those. So these are trustworthy eyewitness accounts.
Right.
But it raises a question, why is that so important? Like, as long as we got sayings of Jesus to live our lives by, we've got some morals, some ethical statements. Why do we need an accurate history of Jesus' life? We don't have histories of other world religion founders. Why do we need a history of Jesus?
Yeah, the difference between Christianity and all the other religions is that Jesus had to have lived. The emphasis on history is essential. Paul says, if Christ was not raised from the dead, our faith is in vain. And so if Buddha never lived, we might still have Buddhism. We'd call it something different. But the fact that Buddha was the one that started doesn't really matter in a sense. But if Christ had not lived and died and was raised from the dead, then everything that we believe would be false.
Okay.
And so there's this real strong emphasis on history. And that's why a lot of work is done to emphasize that what we have in the Gospels is in fact what happened. And the word of the Gospel was passed on for about 30 years orally, in an oral culture, where instead of just writing things down, these people were trained to hear it over and over and over again, and they could remember it well. And that's why we're confident that what they finally wrote down was what actually happened.
Okay. So is it fair to say the Christian faith is not only based on what Jesus said, but what Jesus did?
Yeah.
So we don't care what Buddha did or Confucius did or Muhammad did, but it matters
really
whether
does.
or not Jesus died on the cross to take the hit for our sin, was raised from the dead. That's critical.
Yeah.
Okay, so what about those who say, but what we have in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we have four guys who are writing from the perspective of being Christ followers themselves. So it's biased. It's biased history.
I think the answer is we're all biased, but that doesn't mean we can't say what's true. And you can believe something strongly and still be very, very accurate at describing it. It is possible when you believe things, and Christian cults will illustrate this, that you can believe things and change the truth, but you don't have to necessarily. And so the question is, as you read the Gospels, are there indications that these people really did think that history was important and that they weren't exaggerating and they weren't making up stuff? And there's controls all over the place, that you had the church as a whole continue to tell the story of Jesus, and the groups in the church would have been self-correcting if there were issues. There's evidence in the text itself that they wanted to be historically accurate. They didn't, for example, smooth over Peter, but even though he was the beginning of he was the rock upon which Jesus built his church, and yet in that same passage, Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." And if the church wasn't interested in history, they would have expunged that.
Yes,
but they were interested in history, and so you have those kinds of sayings in the Bible.
So you've got embarrassing things said about the early leaders of the church, which you would airbrush that out if you were making it up. Okay, so when Peter says, Jesus, you shouldn't go to the cross. And Jesus says, Peter, Satan, get behind me. Yeah, we include that kind of stuff.
Yes, we do.
All right. So, someone said to me once too, that if biased testimony means we can't accept anybody who represents a position on something, then we'd have no history, let's say, of the Holocaust. So because we construct that history on the basis of eyewitness accounts of people who were in those death camps. But if you say, well, no, you can't believe them because they were biased, you might as well throw history out the window.
All of it. How do we know anything about World War II? The people who were in World War II wrote about World War II,
yes.
made movies about World War II.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, take a movie like Schindler's List.
Yeah.
That was internal information that was believed and it was important, but that doesn't mean that Spielberg got it wrong.
Yeah. Let's go to another analogy that I hear people use. They say, well, as the Bible got passed on word of mouth to word of mouth, it was kind of like the telephone game. You play that at parties. The first person in line says something to the second person, whispers in their ear. That person says something to the third person, and it goes down the line, and then the 10th person says what they think they heard, and it doesn't sound anything like what the first person said. And people say, that's how the Bible got passed on. So it got so corrupted in its transmission that it can't be trusted.
Yeah, it's a very common analogy and it's completely false. In the telephone game, it's an individual telling an individual, telling an individual, and there's no cost to getting it wrong. In fact, you actually want it to be wrong because when you get to the 10th person, it's funny when they say it.
Yeah.
But first of all, in the Gospels, you have groups of people communicating the gospel to groups of people, and that which just makes it self-correcting. There's people in the group who say, well, Jesus said this, and no, actually it was this. Oh, that's right. And so you have the self-correcting that happens in groups. But the other thing is that it had to be right. They had to get it right because everything was based on the person of Jesus. And so what I tell people is that if you lived in an oral culture where you're used to remembering things precisely, and you played the telephone game, and a group talked to a group, talked to a group, talked to a group, and they said, oh, by the way, if the last group gets it right, you get $1 million. I'll guarantee you they're going to get it right.
Yes. Yeah.
And so when there's costs involved and there's groups correcting,
yes.
It's important. The other thing that's part of this is we so greatly underestimate the power of our memories. And at 71, and first service, I had a senior moment. I forgot where I was. And hi, Jeff, I don't know. And I know that's not his name. But the human mind is capable of remembering things. I got a friend who's memorized the entire Bible, New and Old Testament, word for word, the entire Greek text, word for word, probably all the Hebrew as well. And you think, well, that's kind of freakish. Well, Greek school children learned the Iliad and the Odyssey by memory, 200,000 words. Rabbis memorized the whole Old Testament. I think it's 306,000 words. So we are capable of great feats. All of us are capable of great feats of memory. So when you put that kind of mind in groups with a cost, you can see why the telephone game is a bad analogy.
Yes, yeah. No, I like your emphasis on the cost. I mean, you put it in a positive light. If you were going to be offered $1 million to get it right, you'd get it right. It's actually, with the New Testament, it's the opposite. These people were staking their life. Right. Many of them were going to lose their lives for the message they believed. Yeah. You could be absolutely certain they wanted to make sure they had it right.
Yeah.
So let's go back to how copies then. So it gets committed, the New Testament gets committed to writing. And then the writing is copied, and copies are made of the copies, and copies are made of the copies of the copies. And I want to illustrate this for everybody. Need an eraser here. So let's take a book of the New Testament, Gospel of Luke, let's say. So there's an original. You won't find the original today. Okay, you can't go to some museum in the Middle East and find, oh, that's the original written by Luke's hand. It's not there, okay? It was destroyed over time. And then there were copies made before it was destroyed, and copies made of copies, and copies made of copies of copies, and so on. And then over time, some of these copies were either lost or they were destroyed. So you don't have the original, and you don't have these early copies, and maybe you don't have these over here. This is a vast oversimplification. And you don't have these, let's say, over here. So how do you know what the original said? Okay, it's based on two things, two factors. Okay, one of the factors is how many copies do you have? Because the more copies you have, the better comparison you can make. You following this? The second thing that matters is how old are the oldest copies you have? How close are they to the original? So any piece of ancient writing, whether it's the Bible or it's something written by Plato or Herodotus, the Roman historian or whatever, the only way, we don't have the original of any of that stuff. The only way we can reconstruct it is to have as many copies as possible and have as old as copies as we possibly can. So here's the question I want to ask Bill based on this. How does the New Testament stack up against other pieces of ancient literature in terms of the number of copies and how old the oldest copies are?
Yeah, we have roughly 5,600 manuscripts, Greek manuscripts, some part, some in whole.
5,600.
5,600. But we also have all the translations, like in the Syriac, which were very early. We have citations in the early church fathers. So you could actually reconstruct the entire New Testament without a single Greek manuscript because the early church fathers quoted so much. So we have a plethora. It's hard for me to say plethora because of a certain movie I like, but a plethora of, you guys haven't watched Three Meals, have you?
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm sorry, I got off track. So we have 56, I just can't say the word plethora without laughing inside. Anyway, 5,600 copies. Center for Study of New Testament Manuscripts keeps finding more, so the number keeps going up. When you compare, and the earliest one we have is end of the first century, probably beginning of second century. It's a snippet of John. We have, I think it's 77 manuscripts from the second, third, and fourth century, another 46 from the fifth century.
Wow.
So when you combine how early those are with how many there are, we are really confident we have the original text.
Okay, so compare it with some other ancient piece of literature.
We have an embarrassment of riches. Caesar's Gallic Wars, I had it translated in Latin high school, hated it. But the oldest manuscript that we have in Caesar's Gallic Wars is 9th century. So 900 years passed between the Gallic Wars and the oldest manuscript we have. And so can you trust a document that old? And people in history say, well, that's all we have, so we have to deal with it. You have...
And how many copies of that? Any idea?
I don't know.
Not 5,600.
No. It'd be 10, maybe something like that. Josephus, a Jewish historian, very important.
First
Oldest
century.
manuscript is 5th century. We have 9
Okay, so 400 years later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Plutarch wrote the story of Alexander the Great 400 years after Alexander lived. So what you have is this huge time gap between the event and the writing, and you have even larger time gap between the event and when the first document that we have that talks about it. So you go then to the Gospels, and instead of 1, 2, or 10, you have 5,600. You have a 30-year gap, and you have manuscripts really starting in the 2nd century.
Wow.
So it's totally different. The way I like to put it is if people took how they treated biblical documents about their skepticism, about their historicity, and applied it to all historical documents, we would know nothing about the past.
You'd have to throw out every ancient document.
Every ancient document would be suspect and dismissed.
Wow. So there is a group that you hear from occasionally. I don't know why they do it, but news sources tend to love these stories around Christmas time, around Easter time. Anytime there's a big celebration of Christians, they love to call into question the Bible, the original documents. Did this really happen? And so on. And they're fond of quoting a group called the Jesus Seminar. Okay, and my understanding is this is a group of scholars who vote on what they think is authentic in our copies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and what ought to be tossed out. So do they have good criteria on which they make these decisions?
No. There were 80 some of them. I don't know all of them. I know some of them. But there were 80 or so. They voted with different colored marbles, which is kind of...
So red marble means this is authentic
red
Jesus.
Red marble is the words of Jesus, I would guess.
Yes.
But the thing is, I don't believe there were any evangelicals in the group, so they all came in with their biases. And so, for example, if you don't believe there's such a thing as miracles, then when you come to a miracle story in the gospel, by default, was added later. Toss it out.
Yes. That can't be true. That's your presupposition.
Most of them would probably believe that Jesus never intended to start a church.
Yeah.
So you are Peter, on this rock I will build my church, Jesus said. Well, obviously Jesus never said that because he didn't want to build a church. And so they come in with their biases, and it's interesting. They actually looked not just at the four Gospels, they included the Gospel of Thomas, which I'm sure we'll get to. And they think there's more of Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas than there's in the Gospel of John. And if you read the Gospel of Thomas, you sit there and scratch your head and say, how could anybody think any of Jesus was in this book?
Yes.
So yeah, they were, but it's their biases, their presuppositions that really governed their voting.
So when we come across those articles in the news, read them with a great deal of skepticism. They are probably not, they're not calling Bill Mounce on the phone. They're not calling other conservative scholars. No. They're doing it with this group whose presupposition is there can't be anything of a supernatural.
Right.
Okay.
That's the big one.
Okay. So let's say that you've convinced us that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John actually wrote these Gospels. Another issue that's raised is, but that's four Gospels among a plethora, Bill, I'll use that word. A plethora of other Gospels. There were dozens of Gospels written in the first century, and we don't include those in the Bible. Here's the reason why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John got included. Yeah. And I'm now channeling Dan Brown in the Da Vinci Code.
Right.
He says that, 300 years later, reign of the Emperor Constantine, he wants to unite his realm and decides to do it. Let's do it around the Christian faith. Right. So we got to make Jesus God. So let's pick Gospels that make Jesus God. So for political and theological reasons, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are chosen, and all these other wonderful Gospels are left out. Is that an accurate retelling of the story?
Not in the slightest. You need to understand, the Da Vinci Code is fiction. He says it at the beginning. This is made up, but it's quoted as history. But it's not. It is total fiction. And for Dan Brown and that whole group of people, this is called the Council of Nicaea that the Emperor Constantine called. And they will say, well, at Nicaea in the 300s, that the doctrine of the canon, what books we have in the Bible, was decided. The doctrine of the Trinity was decided by Constantine and his mommy, basically. And we have all the documents for Nicaea, and that is not what was discussed at all. So if Dan Brown comes up in your discussions, it's just really important to say, okay, that's fiction. I'm not going to base what I believe on.
Even if Tom Hanks was in the movie.
Even if Tom Hanks was there, and great actor, but not much of a theologian.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of those other Gospels.
Yeah.
Why were they not included? Were they ruled out for political reasons?
No, they're the unanimous, overwhelming evidence in the first century is that the church accepted four Gospels and four Gospels only. In fact, when they started binding books together as codexes, then only Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were bound together. And the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were always attached. No other names were attached to the Gospels. So these are the Gospels that these four men wrote within a lifetime of Jesus. There were other Gospels written, but they're all later. And all you really have to do is read them to understand why they weren't included. And there were criteria, but I brought my phone up here because I knew you were going to ask this, so I wanted to read something. How many of you heard of the Gospel of Thomas?
Yeah.
Okay, that's the main one that's used. Well, they left out the Gospel of Thomas.
Yeah, you'll hear the critics say that's the gospel that should have been included. I just want to before you read that, I want to reiterate one thing you've said.
Yeah.
For starters, it's written like a century and a half later, something like that?
Gospel of Thomas is generally dated second half of the second century.
Okay.
It's Gnostic, so it's an heretical writing from an heretical sect. So Thomas could not have written it. Thomas was off in India evangelizing, was dead by this time.
So this is not an eyewitness account.
This is not an eyewitness account, and nobody knew about it till it was dug up in 1945.
Okay.
So it just wasn't part of the early church's Bible at all.
So read an excerpt from it. You're going to love this, guys.
They call it the gospel, but it's not a gospel. It's 114 sayings. And here's the last one. And you tell me whether this should be in the Bible, okay? Maybe we'll vote at the end. You can tell me whether it should be in the Bible. 114th saying, Simon Peter said to the apostles, "Make Mary leave us, for females don't deserve life. Oh, come on. That requires a lot stronger response than that. Jesus said, look, I will guide her to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. So sorry, ladies, you're all going to hell as long as you don't look like men. For every female who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah.
So
imagine keeping that out of the Bible.
Yeah, it's just so unfair, those early people. So that's why I say when it comes to this whole issue of the Gospels that were left out, they were second, third century writings, never accepted by the church, and they were, well, that one's about as crazy as it gets.
Okay, so let's talk about what criteria were used. Because again, we hear this argument all the time. People say, well, who even decides what books made it in and what books were kept out? And this was unfair, and we're just keeping out the stuff that we don't want to be in because it contradicts our view. Right. Okay, so what was the criteria? What were the criteria that were used? And
at a practical level, when you have this discussion with someone, the first question you always ask is, well, what book do you want to include? And then you have to ask it very gently because they're going to be embarrassed. Yeah. And then, have you read it?
Yeah.
And that normally will end the discussion.
Yeah.
Because they haven't. They may come up with the name of Gospel of Thomas, but they most likely haven't read it. There appears to have been three criteria for inclusion into the canon, the list of the books that we have.
Okay, wait, back up because you've used the word a couple of times.
Yeah.
Canon is not like boom, boom canon.
No, it's one N.
One N, and what does it mean?
Canon just means it's a standard by which we judge something to be true or not. So canonicity is the process of deciding which books are right, which books are inspired by God. Okay. And so we'll refer to the New Testament canon as the list of the 27 books the church accepted as authoritative.
Okay, so three criteria. Yeah,
three criteria. First one is apostolicity. Who wrote it? Did an apostle or a close associate of an apostle write it? That's why Hebrews had trouble getting accepted as authoritative, because we don't know who wrote it. It's why 2 Peter had trouble getting in, because the Greek of 2 Peter is totally different from the Greek of 1 Peter. And so there was a question about whether he actually wrote it or not. The second criteria is harmony of doctrine and tone. In other words, does this book agree with the books that we've already accepted as authoritative? We call it the core of the canon. There were 22 books that were instantly accepted as authoritative. All of Paul's writings, instantly accepted as being authoritative. And so we have these 22 books, so we have an understanding of what orthodoxy is. So these other books that you compare to them, do they agree or not? So that was that. And then the third one is Catholicity with a small c. Catholicity just means, did the church as a whole accept it? And the decision was not made by a few scholars in a dusty corner reading books, which, by the way, is really fun, but
I'll take your word for it, Bill.
That's aside. That's an aside. They didn't make the decision. The church as a whole recognized which books were inspired, and it's really important. The church did not create. The church is not the authority over the Bible. They did not give the books authority. The gospel, and I'm speaking as a Protestant here, obviously, the Bible defines the church. And so the church's role was not to give it authority, it was to recognize its authority, to recognize that God had put into it. But on that last category about Catholicity, that's why books like 2nd and 3rd John had trouble getting into the canon. They were so short, they probably weren't spread all over the place. Philemon had trouble getting in. Because, if Paul had written that letter to me, I wouldn't want to share it with anybody either.
So it took a while for those books to circulate and the church begin to use them.
Yeah, so those were the three tests. And so when you go to Gospel of Thomas, it fails all of them. It was not written by an apostle. It is radically different in its teaching, and it was never known by the church as a whole. So
those are the three criteria, and they make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah.
And I want to distinguish here a little bit of difference between Roman Catholic theology on the Bible and Protestant. So the Catholic Church in many cases theologians would say, that the church is on par with the Bible in terms of authority. And the church conferred authority on those Bible books. Protestants would say Now, those books were inspired by God. They had authority from the get-go. All the church did was recognize their authority. So the church always stands under the authority of Scripture, which is why, at a church like Christ Community, we have folks coming all the time from a Catholic background, and one of the things that surprises them is, wow, we were never taught the Bible like this before. Yeah. It's because the Bible's such an important book to us. It's the book that is stamped with the authority. This is what God said. And so, we're kind of people of the book.
Yeah. And that is one of the prime differences between Catholicism and Protestantism.
Okay.
I used to live in Boston, and where there were a lot of Catholics, and this was a constant question about, okay, if the Pope teaches it, does that mean it's the same as Jesus?
Yes. Yeah. Okay, let's move on to another topic, contradictions in the Bible. So some are fond of pointing out contradictions, and I'll give an example. We just came through Easter, and so the story told of Jesus' resurrection from the dead. If you read it in Luke's gospel, Luke says people went to the empty tomb. There were 2 angels there, okay? You read the story in Matthew said they went to the empty tomb. There was 1 angel there.
Right.
So this is a contradiction. Either Luke was right and Matthew was wrong, or Matthew was right and Luke was wrong. But obviously you can't trust it because these guys couldn't get their story straight between them. Right. What do you say to that?
Well, whenever I deal with someone that has questions about contradictions, my first question is, again, you have to ask it gently and carefully and kindly, and say, okay, if this is really an important issue to you, let's go look at one. Can you show me one? And most people will be embarrassed because they don't know. There are problem passages,
yeah, they just
but they don't know where
this.
they are.
Yeah.
They don't know where they are. And so you don't want to talk to someone about apparent contradictions when their real issue is the authority of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And the contradictions are a smokescreen. So always start by asking, okay, you got to find out whether it's an honest question or not. Most contradictions are handled by correct interpretation and understanding how the Bible is put together. In this particular example, none of the Gospels claim to tell us everything. That they tell us what they need to tell us to convey the story of Jesus Christ. And so the analogy I like to use for the angels is, I'll tell you, I got a new rifle. Someone after service yesterday said, what was the rifle? And it was a Creedmoor. Anyway, I've got a rifle, and Hayden and I were going to go shoot it. So we went out to where we live, and we were shooting. And well, the fact of the matter is that Shiloh, his wife, did go with us, but that wasn't really part of what I wanted to convey in the story. I wanted to convey that I'm out with my Marine son shooting a new rifle.
Yeah, yeah.
So you do that was it wrong to say that Hayden and I went and shot a rifle? Well, only if I claimed that only Hayden and I went and shot the rifle. So what happens at the tomb is that there obviously were 2 angels there. Only one of them spoke. And one of the Gospels was only interested in what that one angel said. So he said, well, there's an angel there. Again, if the Gospel said only 1 angel was there, you have a contradiction.
Yes.
And so that's the correct interpretation clears up a whole lot of those kinds of issues.
Yeah. So I like the word apparent. Yeah. These contradictions are apparent contradictions till you sit down and you say, wait a second, does this have to be a contradiction? Does the fact that you said you went, shooting a rifle with your son, but you didn't mention, his wife, is that a contradiction? Of course it's not. No. Here's another one. One of the Old Testament witnesses to the slavery, 400 years of slavery in Egypt, God's people, Israel. One of the accounts says it was 400 years. One says it was 430 years. Here's a 30-year difference. Somebody got their information, their math wrong. Yeah. Right?
Well, there are approximations in numbers, and numbers do some interesting things in Hebrew. And so, but in this, I think, and let me back up and say, you have to decide whether you think the Bible is basically reliable or not. And if you come to the conclusion that it's basically reliable, then when you see issues like that, either you could say, I need to find out how to harmonize, how to take care of the problem, or I have to say, I don't know what the solution is, but I believe there is one. Yeah. And which is, in my life, that was part of my story of coming to the point where I would trust the Bible, and even if I didn't know the contradictions, I had people I can call and find out. So I actually called an Old Testament buddy of mine about a week ago, and I said, what do you do with the 400, 430 business? And there's some very complicated, intricate descriptions of it. But the easiest one is they were in Egypt for 430 years. Joseph was alive. That Pharaoh was alive. The Jews would have been treated very, very well. After about 30 years, apparently, he got a new Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, and that's when the persecution started. So when it says they were persecuted for 400 years, that's true. But the first 30 years of the 430 was a piece of cake for them.
Yes.
So just something as simple as that can often just explain away these issues.
So if you're determined to find a contradiction, you'll make anything into a contradiction.
Right.
But if you have a basic confidence, I think this is reliable,
right,
you're going to recognize there are easy to explain, oftentimes,
right,
easy to explain solutions to the issue. Let's go back to the question of comparing the copies.
Okay.
Copies with the copies to reconstruct the original. Bart Ehrman, well-known Bible scholar like yourself, he started out a conservative evangelical scholar. He considers himself now, I read the other day, he calls himself a happy agnostic. Doesn't believe in Jesus, doesn't believe in the Bible anymore. But he claims in a New York Times best-selling book called Misquoting Jesus that there are over 400,000 differences among the copies here. 400,000. So if you say Jesus said this because Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John records it, nah. The chances are Jesus never said that because of all these variants, all these differences among the copies. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, he's a very good scholar. He's very powerful as a debater. If you watch him on YouTube, you go, wow, I mean, that was impressive. But that doesn't make him right. He's famous for saying there's 400,000 errors in the manuscripts. Excuse me. Part of the problem is there's only 138,000 words in the Greek Testament. All right? How do you get from 138,000 to 400,000? Well, here's how you do it. If in one manuscript, in this passage, it says the name, for example, of John, and John can be spelled with one N or two N's. And let's say in this manuscript, they're new in Greek. I have to say that for all my Greek students. I used to make them do push-ups when they said they were N's instead of news. Anyway, that's back when you could make students do push-ups. Anyway, it's late in the day, Bill. If this manuscript has the word John and it has two N's, and then a manuscript from 1,000 years later has the same passage but has one N, that's counted as two variants.
So we're getting to 400,000 real quick.
One word, two variants. And so you could even have silly ones. There's two Greek words that are very, very similar. I think they're horse and man. And they get mixed up in some of the manuscripts. Yeah. And so that's how you get to the 400,000. But you can never talk about variations among the manuscripts without talking about significance. And that's the absolute key in this whole thing. Over 70% of the differences are accounted for by spelling differences. So
of these 400,000, just rule out 70% of them
70% are gone.
From the get-go because they're spelling differences.
Right, and you spelled Ioannes with one N or two N's.
Yes.
The Greek word for he is st, or you can say estin with an N sound on the end. Manuscripts vary, and so that's how you get to 700,000. Almost all the other differences are so easily, when you look at them, you go, oh, I know how that happened. And what it is, like, for example, the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew says, blessed are the poor in spirit. In Luke, possibly a parallel passage, Jesus says, blessed are the poor. Well, some scribe transcribing Luke, blessed are the poor, he knows that in Matthew it's blessed are the poor in spirit, so he changes Luke to blessed are the poor in spirit.
One of the copies.
Yeah, one of the copies. And so we look at that and we go, well, obviously he's trying to harmonize the two stories.
Yes.
And they may not even be the same sermon.
Yes.
But you start doing that. The way to put this in perspective of the 400,000, if you look at the modern Greek translation we all use, the United Bible Society for the most part, it lists all the variants, all the differences that have any significance at all. And it's right at 1,400. So you're
far
from
cry from
400,000 down to
400,000.
14. And of those 1,400, 300, and I think it's 62 words they're not totally sure of. Only 362.
Out of
if you look at your
400,000.
English Bibles, they've noticed in your footnotes, excuse me, if you look in the footnotes, it'll say other MS or other MSS have.
And MS and MSS stands for manuscripts or copies. Yeah. Okay.
In other words, these are the variants that we thought were important that you be aware of. There's 282 in the NIV. There's 460 in the ESV.
Yes.
So it's a way to say, yes, there's 400,000 differences. Most of them are totally insignificant and are either silly or have no effect on meaning at all. You're really down to 362, somewhere in that area.
Here's the devious part too. I'm going to use the word devious.
Yeah.
Because I've heard Bart Ehrman say when he's pushed, oh yeah, actually there are a few that are significant. That's it. But on the other hand, he keeps saying this, 400,000, 400,000.
Yep.
And so it undermines the credibility of the Bible, but when push comes to shove, you say, these are really insignificant differences. They've got nothing, they're spelling differences, and none of them change any of the doctrines of the Christian faith, do they?
No, none at all. So we have 5,600 manuscripts and growing of the New Testament. We have 99% of surety. We have exactly what was originally written, and that remaining 1% is actually 0.03% remaining that we're not sure, but none of them have any effect on anything, not just major doctrines, really on anything that we believe.
Okay, I'm going to jump ahead because I'm running out of time here. We could spend a couple hours together. But versions, translations. So we use, as was said earlier, the New International Version. It's the most popular English translation today. Occasionally I'll run into people who come from a more conservative background and they're like, whoa, you don't use the King James Version? Like that's the only trustworthy version. I happen to believe, because of the training I've had, the schooling I've had, that actually the NIV is a better translation than the King James Version. You tell us why.
Well, it is for a couple of reasons. One is that it's understandable, and the function of translation is to communicate meaning. And if I read in James about the perspicuity of naughtiness, I still don't know what that means.
that's the King James. Yeah.
That's the King James.
The perspicuity of naughtiness.
Perspicuity of naughtiness. I think that's what it. Yeah. And so the NIV has a depth of style that I've not seen in another book.
Yes.
Much less another version of the Bible. And the emphasis is on conveying the meaning accurately. But also, the NIV and all modern translations are based on a different set of Greek manuscripts than the King James had. The King James is based on a very select set of manuscripts that came out of the 12th century. And it's all they had, so they used them. But since then, we've discovered a lot of manuscripts that are a lot older, especially the 5th century manuscripts, and they're different.
Yes.
The King James has a story of the woman caught in adultery, which I just wish we could change the name of that. That's a terrible name because a man committed adultery, true, and he should have been out there. Might have another topic. The older manuscripts don't have that story.
Yeah.
It was added later. The longer ending in Mark, the people handling snakes. I'm from the Appalachians. My family's from Gravel Switch, Kentucky, and it's my cousins handling snakes and drinking poison. In compliance with what the Bible says to do in Mark 16.
The King James.
That's in the King James. The older manuscripts don't have that ending. And so all modern translations are based on these older manuscripts where there's been less time for people to change them.
Yes.
And hence they're more reliable.
So it goes back to this diagram again. So the King James Version, translated in 1611, worked with what it had. And since that time, there's many, many more copies that have been discovered and older copies. So what we have is an even more accurate. Right. Another thing that always, I just have to smile at when people tell me, but the contemporary translations take all the reverence out of it. King James has got the these and the thous and whatever. And I want to say, but that's how people talked in 1611. A lot of people don't know the Greek of the New Testament. They couldn't figure out for years, what kind of Greek it was, because it wasn't classical Greek. Right. It was the Greek of the streets, what was called Koine Greek. Yeah. It was commonplace Greek. So to have a translation that, is Old English just makes no sense when you could have it in today's language.
You want to convey the message of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, and the meaning of that in a language just like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did, in the language that people can understand. And the NIV and most modern translations are so much more understandable.
Good at doing that. Well, you cover this in greater depth, so anybody who's got questions about the trustworthiness of the NIV over against the King James or whatever, you go into depth. I just want a closing comment, because we've dealt with left brain stuff here, rational arguments, and some right brain folks out there, they're really tired right now, trying to follow trying to follow all these arguments. So I want to ask a right brain question at the end. Okay, what impact has the Bible had on your life?
Hey, can I step back just for a quick second?
Yeah.
I've pushed my ministry. We have 8 classes on these topics on biblical training. And if you go to biblicaltraining.org/trust, you'll see them all. So you can get the book, or you can, BT is all free. And so you can get it there. I grew up in a Christian home, an academic home. My dad was a pastor and a professor and a university president. I've never not believed the Bible. And so it's kind of like, I tried at one time to question my faith, and I just laughed. I said, I know it's true, because it's simply part of the fabric of my life. And so it's hard to know the impact that it's had, except I was trying to remember this. Something happened a couple of weeks ago, and I can't remember what it was, but I walked away from the situation saying, they have no hope. They have no hope. And I thought, how can you live without hope? And because the Bible is true, and it tells me the story of the life, death, and resurrection of God became man, I have hope. And I told the story, not in this service, I don't think. I had trouble getting here because the winds in Salt Lake were so strong. I've never had a plane pushed off the runway when I was trying to land before. I mean, we're headed down the runway, all of a sudden we're not on the runway. And the pilot tried 3 times and finally went to Boise. Anyway, I remember, and I thought, well, if I die, I die, because I have hope. I know why I live. I know what I was called to do. And I know where I'm going when I die. I don't know how people can live without hope. I really don't. And so that's got to be the greatest impact the Bible has on me, is that I know who I am and where I'm headed.
So this is a credible book with a message that's life-changing, and it holds out hope. I do want to say a word about this. This is Bill's book, Why I Trust the Bible. We ran out of copies, so we've had it available at all of our campuses. There may still be a copy or two at some of the other campuses. I know in St. Charles we've run out of it, but we've got a QR code on the screen right now. So if you want this book, the QR code will take you to our online store. So get your phone out and get that QR code. And the other book, I sometimes fail to mention my own books on the topic, but I did a series for Moody several years back, 4 short books outlining the Bible's storyline, how to read the Bible and get something out of it for your life. This volume, number 2 of the 4, is called Foundation. It's on the reliability of the Bible. I am a put the cookies on the bottom shelf kind of guy. So this is Bill Mounce for dummies. All right. So if you want the fuller version and the scholarly backup, Bill's book is excellent. If you want to just pick something up today, my book is available in the shops as well. I'm going to turn things over to our campus pastors at the other campuses right now for a close. I'll close in St. Charles. But Bill, we just want to say thanks for coming to Christ Community today.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Would you stand together with me? That was good stuff, wasn't it? So again, if you're left brain, you were really digging everything. And if you're right brain, it's like, I need a nap. So come on back next week, because we get into the right brain stuff. So how do I read this book in a way that shapes my life? See, what you can't get away from, there are people who want to dismiss Christianity because they don't like the ethics, the morality, the this, the that, or the message. But what you can't get away from is this is a historically accurate book that tells about Jesus, who had certain claims. And I tend to look at people who doubt, the Christian faith and say, well, this is what's true about Jesus and what he said. You got to deal with that. What are you going to do with Jesus? So we'll get into that next week. Let me close by just asking God's blessing on your life. And when I say amen, We're dismissed. No closing song today. In the back corner of the room is our prayer center. Our elders, the first weekend of the month, are always available. So they're back there. If you've got issues related to your job, health, marriage, anything going on in your life, you just need some prayer. We got some heavy duty prayers back there today. Go on back. I'll hang out there when I finally get past the crowd. I'll be back there as well. Bill will be in the center of the atrium lobby. So if you're like ordering his book, but you've got some questions you want to ask in the meantime, go ahead and get in line and we'll cue you up and you'll get your opportunity to talk to Bill. How about hands out like this if you want God's blessing? God, we got our hands out as a way of saying we know where blessing in life comes from. It comes from you. So God, I pray that your holy word would shape the lives of the people who are open-handed before you right now. I pray that you would give us a new love for your word. I pray, God, that the Holy Spirit of God would come to live on the inside as we surrender to Jesus so that we will have an internal life coach helping us understand the scripture and apply it to our lives. I pray that this week your word would encourage, it would direct, it would rebuke or give us a kick in the pants if that's what we need, God. But I pray for the effectiveness of your word in our life this week. Change us, make us more and more like your son, Jesus. It's in his name we pray. Amen. Have a great week.